It's got AUM, what's that? Living in the sunlight, living in the moonlight, is that an original? When Tiny Tim passed out on The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson thought it was just another stunt, but something bad was going on behind the scenes. From taking 6 showers a day to secretly asking for an open marriage, Tiny Tim's strange behavior had finally reached its limit. Now, decades later, we're learning why TV's favorite oddball was quietly fired, and the shocking truth about Herbert Buckingham Corey was born on April 12, 1932, in New York City. His parents were from very different backgrounds. His father, Eutas Corey, was a Lebanese Catholic married worker in a textile factory, and his mother, Tilly Staff, was a Polish-Jewish garment worker and the daughter of an R. Their home in Washington Heights was full of different traditions, but Herbert never felt like he fit in. He was a shy and awkward child who spent his time inside while other kids played outside. His obsession started when he was 5 years old, and his father brought home a wind-up gramophone and a 78 RPM record of Henry Burr's Beautiful Ohio. The sound of that old record affected him in a way that made him feel like he had found a secret world from the past. From that point on, nothing else mattered. He spent hours at the New York Public Library looking for sheet music and records, from the 1890s to the 1930s, copying rare songs by hand. While most kids his age were interested in the newest trends, Burt was digging deeper into the past and became a living archive of forgotten music school. Was another story. He went to George Washington High School, but had such bad grades that he repeated his sophomore year twice and eventually dropped out. His parents were worried about his future, but he didn't seem to care because he had already found his true passion: playing music. He taught himself to play the guitar and ukulele and practiced for hours every day. He liked artists like Arthur Godfrey and Rudy Vallee and studied old recordings and imitating their styles. One day, he discovered something strange. He could sing in a high, trembling falsetto. At first, it was just an experiment, but he soon realized that this voice was something special. It made him different, and he liked that. By the 1950s, he had fully accepted his differences. He grew his hair long, which was almost unheard of for men at the time. He covered his face in white makeup, calling it a sign of purity. His mother was horrified. She thought her son was going crazy and even thought about sending him to Bellwether Hospital for psychiatric treatment. His father stepped in and told her to let him be. Herbert might have been strange, but he wasn't crazy. He was just going down a path that no one else could see. Tiny Tim's rise to fame was just as strange as the man himself. He went by names like Larry Love, Texarkana Teeks, and Judas K. Foxglove, in the hopes that one of them would stick. Hubert's Museum in Live Flea Circus in Times Square was where the strangest people went to perform. Sword swallowers, fire breathers, and Tiny Tim fit right in. By the early 1960s, he had found a home in Greenwich Village, where he played at small clubs like Page 3 for 6 hours a night for just $96 a month. His act was unlike anything people had seen before. He sang forgotten Tin Pan Alley songs in a high falsetto and strummed his ukulele with great precision. His shows felt like a strange mix of comedy and nostalgia, but it wasn't just his music that made people feel that way. Some people thought he was funny, while others saw something special in him. In 1963, his manager George King gave him a new name, Tiny Tim. It was meant to be ironic since he was 6'1" and taller than most people, but the name came from the weak little boy in A Christmas Carol and fit him perfectly. By the mid-1000s, 960s, he had a loyal fan base and was talked about in underground music circles. Most people still didn't know who he was, but that was about to change. On January 22, 1968, Tiny Tim walked onto the set of Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. The show was known for its fast-paced humor and surprise guests, but no one was ready for what they saw. He carried a shopping bag onto the stage, pulled out his ukulele, and started to sing. His first song was A Tight a Tasket, and then he sang The Good Ship Lollipop. The audience was shocked. His high-pitched voice, long hair, and strange, old-fashioned suit made him look like a lost character from another time. They didn't know what to think. Some people laughed because they thought he was a comedy act, while others were amazed by how sincere he was. He went back to the show twice more that year and performed a song that would forever define him, Tiptoe Through the Tulips. His eerie falsetto voice could be heard on TVs across America. It was strange, it was unforgettable, and overnight, Tiny Tim became a star. Dan Rowan, one of the show's hosts, later said that he was exactly the kind of act they wanted. He was strange, he was unexpected, and he was impossible to ignore by the end of 1968. Tiny Tim wasn't just a cult figure, he was famous. That same year, he released his first album, God Bless Tiny Tim. It was released by Remise Records and produced by Richard Perry. The album mixed pop standards with songs from the early 20th century to make something both nostalgic and new. Tiptoe Through the Tulips was the album's biggest hit. It made it into the top 20 on the Billboard Hot 100 and stayed there for 32 weeks. Over 200,000 copies were sold. Critics didn't know what to think. Some thought it was just a novelty, but others saw how brilliant it was. Tiny Tim didn't just sing in falsetto, he had range. His voice could go from a deep baritone to a delicate whisper. Songs like Coming Home Party and I Got You Babe showed how versatile he was, and some even compared the album to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Tiny Tim wasn't just breaking musical rules, he was also breaking expectations. His act blurred the lines between comedy and seriousness. Tiny Tim's fame took off when he made his first appearance on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson on April 4, 1968. He sang Tiptoe Through the Tulips, which made Carson laugh and be confused, but something about Tiny Tim captivated him. Over the years, Carson became one of Tiny Tim's favorite guests, inviting him on the show more than 20 times. Tiny Tim's engagement to Miss Vicky, then 17 years old, was one of the most unexpected events in the history of television. The announcement was made live on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson in September 1969. Tiny Tim, who was already famous for his oddball persona and falsetto singing voice, was 37 years old at the time, which shocked the audience. The age difference was shocking, but so was the way they met. Miss Vicky asked for an autograph 3 months earlier, and Tiny Tim, who was always interested in classic romance, fell in love right away that summer. They asked her parents for permission to get married, and the engagement was both a personal milestone and a great way to get publicity. Tiny Tim had become a frequent guest on The Carson Show because of his quirky charm. Carson, who had a sharp sense of showmanship, played along with the moment when he joked that they should get married on the show itself. The idea quickly became reality, and Tiny Tim, who was always up for a good time, jumped at the chance. By the time the ceremony took place, it would have been shown live to millions of people. On December 17th, 1,969, 45 million people watched what had become a national sensation. It was the second most watched TV event of the decade after the moon landing. The set was decorated with 1,000,000 tulips flown in from Holland as a tribute to Tiny Tim's famous song, Tiptoe Through the Tulips. Reverend William Glenn Eskridge officiated the wedding, and the vows included promises they had written themselves, like not getting puffed up. Instead of champagne, they toasted. Tiny Tim didn't drink alcohol, so he made sure the party fit his lifestyle. The wedding was so big that it had never been seen before. To give you an idea, Kim Kardashian's wedding to Chris Humphrey in 2011 only had 4 million viewers, and the royal wedding of Prince William and Kate Middleton had only 23 million American viewers. Tiny Tim's wedding was on a whole other level. It wasn't just a ceremony, it was a TV show. NBC paid for the whole thing and they knew it. Behind the scenes, there were problems. Tiny Tim's strange behavior made planning hard because he was always thinking about the smallest details. Producers were worried about how unpredictable he might be during the live broadcast, but when the cameras rolled, everything went smoothly. The episode got an amazing 85% Nielsen rating, which meant that 85% of TVs in use at the time were tuned into The Tonight Show. It seemed like a fairy tale, but people who were there said it was real. There were rumors of fights and cheating before the wedding, and Tiny Tim's diary entries showed that he was having doubts about his own feelings. He wasn't sure if he really loved Miss Vicky or if he was just excited about the wedding. The wedding gave his career a huge boost, but it also put a lot of pressure on his personal life. After the ceremony, they made a few more TV appearances together and even went back to The Tonight Show for a post-wedding interview. Even though they looked happy, Tiny Tim's relationship started to fall apart right after the ceremony. As they sat in the limousine together, he shockingly told his new wife that he wanted an open marriage. Miss Vicky was shocked because she had just married a man who was open about his strong Christian beliefs and who had said he was saving himself for marriage. Now, just hours after their vows, he wanted the freedom to see other women. This wasn't a sudden change. Tiny Tim had been having problems with this even while he was engaged to Miss Vicky. At one point, he almost left her for another woman named Miss Iris, but he later admitted that he only stayed because he couldn't bear to break Miss Vicky's heart. He had a strange way of seeing love. He treated women like they were holy, but he was also interested in new relationships. For Miss Vicky, the marriage fell apart almost right away. They were legally married for 8 years, but their relationship ended in 2 because she wanted a home and a family. Tiny Tim wanted to focus on his career and his strange habits. Their daughter, Tulip Victoria, was mostly raised by Miss Vicky, while Tiny Tim sank deeper into his own world, which was made up of habits that most people thought were strange. Tiny Tim was very obsessed with cleanliness. He took up to 6 showers a day and brushed his teeth 4 times using a mix of Crest, McLean's, and Gleam toothpaste. He never used regular towels, only disposable paper towels. He thought it was gross when people used regular toilet paper in public bathrooms. He wouldn't even go inside his parents' house if he had to use the bathroom. His eating habits were just as strange. He avoided eating in front of other people and preferred to eat alone, following strict routines. Once he ordered a whole hotel menu not to eat but to arrange the food in a decorative display. He believed in eating only raw vegetables and honey and avoiding cooked or processed foods whenever possible. These choices weren't just about health for Tiny Tim, they were part of a bigger picture. He believed in both physical and spiritual purity. He married 3 times, first to Miss Vicky in 1969, then to Jan Alice in 1984, and finally to Susan Marie Gardner in 1995. But in all 3 marriages, he avoided living with his wives for long periods of time. With Miss Vicky, he had an early sepsis operation because she wanted a stable life, while he liked to travel and have his own space. With his second wife, Jan, they split up just 6 months after getting married, but they were still legally married. Over a decade later, his third wife, Susan, said that even though they were married, they lived in different places in the same city. Tiny Tim admitted that he had trouble with relationships. He liked the thrill of romance, but he lost interest once it was over. He insisted on sleeping in freezing cold rooms with no heat or air conditioning, which most people couldn't handle. He saw love as magical, but he also stayed away from it. Besides that, Tiny Tim wanted to show that he was more than just a He loved early 20th century songs and thought of himself as a serious musician, but the music business didn't see him that way. After his first album, Tiny Tim's record label put out 2 more albums. His second album had a more serious tone to show his range, but fans wanted the same over-the-top performance they were used to. His third album, All My Little Friends, was a collection of children's songs that won a Grammy but didn't help sales by 1,970. Without the support of a major label, his record label had given up on him, and his contract was over. Things only got worse. The media that used to praise his uniqueness now made fun of him. Satirical magazines like Sick exaggerated his quirks and cruel ways, and people who used to cheer for him were now laughing at him. Tiny Tim knew this. Even at his peak, he had said that people made fun of him in public, and now that his career was falling apart, the laughter was louder than ever. But he refused to go away. Tiny Tim kept performing. As his fame faded, he played small gigs at unknown venues and even traveled with a circus. But his passion never died, and he never stopped being himself, no matter how people saw him. Then, in January 2009, Australian artist Martin Sharp had a big idea. He wanted Tiny Tim to set a world record for the longest non-stop professional singing marathon. Sharp had been fascinated with Tiny Tim for years, painting his portrait over and over, producing his albums, and bringing him to Australia more than once. The performance was at Luna Park in Sydney, and Tiny Tim sang non-stop for over 2 hours and 17 minutes. Sharp's camera crew filmed the whole thing, and by the end, the record had been set. But what should have been a simple accomplishment became tangled up in something much stranger. 5 months later, a fire tore through Luna Park, killing 7 people. Sharp became convinced that there was a link between the fire and Tiny Tim's performance, and he was determined to prove that it wasn't an accident. He started working on Street of Dreams, a movie that was supposed to be a biography of Tiny Tim and an investigation into the Luna Park fire, but Sharp never finished editing it. An unfinished version of the movie was shown at film festivals in 1988, and you can still find it online. Sharp and Tiny Tim continued to work together, and Sharp produced many of Tiny Tim's later albums, such as Rock Chameleon and Keeping My Troubles to Myself. He also brought Tiny Tim back to Australia many times during the 1980s and 1990. When Tiny Tim first appeared on The Tonight Show on April 4th, 1991, SN 1968, he didn't look or sound like anyone else. He had long curly hair, played the ukulele, and had a voice that could soar into a falsetto. He was impossible to ignore. Johnny Carson, who was always up for a joke, made lighthearted comments that played on the ridiculous, but they were never mean. People were really interested in who Tiny Tim was and where he came from. They weren't just amused, they were also curious. Tiny Tim became famous overnight that night. He went back 13 times over the next 20 months, and each time was a mix of comedy, music, and pure unpredictability. But just as quickly as he became famous, he started to fade. His appearances on The Tonight Show became less frequent, and by the early 1970s, he was hardly ever seen on TV. His last known performance on the show was in 1979 when he sang Rod Stewart's "Do You Think I'm Sexy" while wearing a jacket covered in comic book pages. It was as strange as it was funny. After that, he was never seen or heard from again. With his high-pitched voice and ukulele, Tiny Tim was one of a kind and will be remembered for a long time. But behind the happy songs and silly performances, his health was failing. He had diabetes and congestive heart failure, two serious conditions that kept getting worse. Doctors told him over and over again to stop performing because his body couldn't handle it. But Tiny Tim couldn't imagine his life without music, no matter how weak he was. On September 28, 1996, he showed up at a ukulele festival in Massachusetts. There were only about 135 people there, but they were excited to see him. As he stepped forward to introduce the band, something went wrong. He fell face first onto the stage. The crowd gasped and yelled for him to get back up, but he didn't. He was rushed to the hospital and spent almost 3 weeks recovering. His doctors told him they would give him a clear warning if he did it again. He couldn't keep performing because his heart was weak, his diabetes was out of control, and his diet wasn't helping. If he wanted to live, he had to stop, but Tiny Tim wouldn't listen. He had spent his whole life chasing music, and he couldn't give it up. 2 months later, he went to Minneapolis for a benefit gala at the Women's Club. Before the show, he told his wife Susan that he wasn't feeling well, and she begged him to rest, but he refused because he was a performer and he didn't want to let anyone down. Many people had already left by the time he got on stage, but he still performed. He sang songs and ended with his most famous hit, "Tiptoe Through the Tulips." As he sang, his body gave out again and he collapsed in the middle of the song. His wife ran to him to help him back to their table, but he was unconscious and never woke up. Paramedics did CPR and rushed him to the hospital, but there was nothing they could do. At 11:20 p.m., he was pronounced dead. His death was sad, but not a surprise, because he had been pushing himself to the limit for years. Music was his life, and he gave his life for it. His voice, performances, and unwavering dedication left a lasting mark on the world. In 1968, Tiny Tim was at the height of his fame. That year, he performed at the Royal Albert Hall, which was known for attracting some of the best musicians in the world. The whole show was recorded, but for some reason, Reprise Records never released it. The tape sat untouched for decades until it was found in 2000. Rhino Handmade finally released it to the public. The CD was limited edition and sold out quickly. Demand was so high that Rhino reissued it under their main label, giving even more fans a chance to hear a performance that had been hidden for over 30 years. More lost recordings started to come to light in 2009 when Collector's Choice released "I've Never Seen a Straight Banana Rare Moments Volume 1, an album of songs Tiny Tim recorded in 1976 that were some of his favorites. Richard Barron, who had worked closely with Tiny Tim, produced the album, which came out in 1878. That same year, Justin Martell, a dedicated researcher of Tiny Tim's life, announced that he was writing a biography. He spent years gathering details by talking to people who knew Tiny Tim best and collecting rare materials. In 2016, the book was finally published under the title Eternal Troubadour: The Improbable Life of Tiny Tim. Martell was already thought to be one of the leading experts on Tiny Tim. He had even contributed liner notes to "I've Never Seen a Straight Banana" and a later compilation album called Tiny Tim Lost and Found 1963-1974, rare and unreleased, which came out in 2011. People's interest in Tiny Tim kept growing, and in 2013 a second biography, Tiny Tim Tiptoe Through a Lifetime, was published. It was written by L.E.L. Tarling and had illustrations by Martin Sharp. That same year, a rare recording of a 1974 live performance by Instead of a normal release, they did something different. They put it out as a limited edition wax cylinder, which is an old-fashioned format from the early days of recording music. More hidden material came after. In 2016, Ship to Shore Phono released Tiny Tim's America, an album of demos recorded in 1,974. These tracks were never finished, but in 2015, producer Richard Barron and Tiny Tim's cousin Eddie Rinn added the finishing touches to make the album complete. It was called Rare Moments Volume 2. People were still interested in Tiny Tim years after he died. In 2020, Swedish journalist and filmmaker Johan von Sydow released Tiny Tim King for a Day, a documentary that looked into his strange life and career. New recordings, lost performances, and books kept his story alive. Tiny Tim wasn't just a musician, he was an unforgettable figure who left behind a world of music waiting to be discovered. His name is painted on the famous mural outside First Avenue. This award is only given to artists who have sold out shows or made a lasting effect on the venue's history. It's not just a decoration, it's a tribute to musicians who helped shape the culture of the city.